Hey YouTube! With the upcoming release of SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, I thought it would be a great time to take a look back at another SpongeBob game that I spent a ton of time playing as a child. That game is SpongeBob Creature-From-The-Krusty-Krab. At the end of the video, I'll let you know if you should buy it or pass it. Just a quick heads up, I'll be giving a very high-level overview of the plot during this video. I'm not going to give away a ton of plot details, but I will give away a few. So with that being said, let's get started. So when you start a new game, you're greeted with an intro that's very similar to something that we'd see in the show. We see SpongeBob, Squidward's, and Patrick's house, and we have commentary from the show's narrator. We then move into SpongeBob's house and see that SpongeBob is not just sleeping on his bed, but his bed also doubles as a race car. SpongeBob's bed car then takes off from his house and lands on a racetrack, and SpongeBob's cute, somewhat normal-looking sponge face turns into a thing of nightmares before the game hands over the controls to you. During this race sequence, you'll be tasked with hitting checkpoints throughout the track before the time expires, and I think that calling it a race like I have been probably isn't the proper term here, as it's more of a race against the clock than anything else. I really wish they would have included more iconic Bikini Bottom locations on or around the track. The buildings here just feel super generic, and I gotta be honest, this race sequence is really boring. So after your race is when we're introduced to the platforming sections of this game. In this section, SpongeBob is tasked with recovering his driver's license.
My license!
Maybe it's just me, but I feel that this is a really strange way to start a SpongeBob game. This first platforming environment really looks nothing like a location we'd see in the show, and if you took out SpongeBob and the SpongeBob characters, you literally wouldn't be able to tell that this is a SpongeBob game. So with all that being said, the platforming here actually isn't too terrible. The controls feel rather tight, SpongeBob has a jump and a double jump which helps him clear big gaps, and the environments in this section are fairly easy to navigate. Remember that this is ultimately a kids game, so don't expect a ton of difficulty from this level, or really the whole game, as it's a pretty easy ride the entire time. During this level, we are introduced to the basic mechanics of this game. Throughout the game, there are several winches and levers that you will need to turn to manipulate the environment around you, and you will also have to fight enemies occasionally. SpongeBob has two attacks. I'm playing on the GameCube, so if you hit the B button, SpongeBob will flap his arms around him and take out enemies that are in his bubble. But if you hit the X button, SpongeBob will stretch his arms out for a more ranged attack. You also have a dashing attack. If you hold down the right trigger, SpongeBob will begin charging into whatever lies ahead of him. The dashing attack also proves to be useful for puzzles later on. I actually don't mind this level as much as most tutorial levels. With Mrs. Puff acting as your guide and SpongeBob letting out quips of dialogue, it's actually really fun to hear the characters banter. So once you find your license, a very deformed Patrick pulls a motorcycle up to the starting line and wants to race. This is when you begin the second racing section of the game. Once again, it is entirely unfair to call this section a race, as there's no way to catch up or pass Patrick, and you're really only racing against the clock in the top right corner of your screen. I actually did catch up to Patrick at one point, but when I tried to pass him, the game decided to throw him an additional 1,000 yards ahead of me really fast. It looked really goofy, but it just goes to show that that was never the intention of the developer, to have you be able to catch up to him. After your second race, in quotation marks, you'll be tasked with tracking down parts to beef up your bed car. Here you are introduced to two enemy types. A really basic enemy type that can be taken down with a single hit, and then a much stronger enemy with a shield that can only be taken down by first dashing at the enemy to stun them, and then just hitting them with a regular attack. These are really the only two primary enemy types throughout the game. The enemies are reskinned to match their environments, and maybe we'll have an attribute or two changed, but these are the guys that you're going to be fighting for the majority of the game. Later on in this level, you are introduced to the Sleepy Seeds. The game doesn't give them a ton of explanation on what these are exactly, but you need them to unlock alternate endings at the end of the game, so try to find as many as you possibly can. So after you collect another bed car part, you'll be once again tasked with racing on a very similar looking track, this time against Plankton. This cycle of racing and platforming repeats itself yet another time before moving on to another section of the game. Here lies the game's biggest problem by far. It takes what would normally be an okay to fun section and stretches it out as long as it possibly can. It feels like just when you've had enough of a certain section, it's started to become boring, and you want to move on to something else, the game has at least another 15 to 30 minutes of that section to go. After this, we are taken to the first Patrick section of the game. But before we get there, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge how cool these loading screens are. There are quite a few of these throughout the game, and the art is all really high quality, and you can tell that a lot of love was put into them. When we load into the first Patrick section, we learn that Starfish Man, who is Patrick, must defeat the dreaded Patrick, who is Patrick's evil alter ego. I honestly love the platforming sections that focus on Patrick in this game. In this level particularly, there's a really cool comic book aesthetic and filter that's put over the gameplay, and it's just a really nice touch. The instructions and hints for this level are given to you through phone calls and phone booths throughout the level, and this adds a ton to that comic book aesthetic. I like this, even if it does slow down the gameplay quite a bit. The dialogue during the sequences are also really funny.
Hello, may I help you?
So that makes up for that slowdown a little bit. You'll also notice that this game has pulled the camera in quite a bit to emphasize combat. And while this definitely helps to make Patrick feel like more of an imposing force, it makes it quite a bit harder to see around the environment. And because the environments in this part of the game look so incredibly similar, it can be sometimes difficult to tell where exactly you should be heading next. Patrick's moveset is also very similar to SpongeBob's, but instead of having a range attack like SpongeBob does, Patrick can create wind vortexes that can be used to attack enemies and take down posters of Dreaded Patrick throughout the city. Like you probably did in the last SpongeBob section, you'll probably become pretty fatigued pretty quickly while playing this, as it does become repetitive. And thankfully this time the developers spiced things up a bit by having you save someone who is stuck on a train track. This is seriously the hardest, and I mean the hardest part of this game. I was literally tapping the A button so fast that I physically could not tap it any faster, and I was still not able to fight this train off. Thankfully, the game notices when you fail this section a few times and makes it less difficult for you. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you're tasked with knocking down Dreaded Patrick's statue.
I'll push over his statue! That will show him!
And it seems like this would be a nice finale for the level. But the game just keeps going. The mayor comes out, and while you'll immediately notice that he's the most soulless eyes you've ever seen, he asks you to help clean up the city. Patrick agrees to help and assumes the mayor wants him to clean up the city by collecting laundry detergent.
Lots and lots of laundry detergent!
While this is a funny and certainly a very Patrick way to think, it becomes a lot less funny when you realize you're going to have to spend another 15 or minutes so collecting laundry detergent. This part just screams padding to me. It feels like it should have been more of an optional side quest than anything else. After this is completed, a cutscene will take you to Dreaded Patrick's lair, and you'll have to fight your way to the top of a rocket to rescue an innocent bystander. Once you reach the bystander, Patrick is knocked out by Dreaded Patrick's goons. We are then taken to the first Plankton section of the game, and I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about this area because there simply isn't a lot here to enjoy. Basically, Plankton makes a Krabby Patty absolutely massive and alive and angry with his growth ray and has to run over the rooftops of Bikini Bottom to get away from it. This mission feels like it belongs in a mobile game more than anything else, and I just really wish it wasn't included. It can essentially be beaten by just holding the analog stick to the right and pressing the A button to jump over things. Once again, I think the developer noticed that this section was a bit boring and tried to spice it up with a minigame, and essentially the goal of the minigame is to collect as many parts as you can without the Krabby Patty seeing you. And while this was a nice change of pace initially, the game repeats the formula of run, minigame at least 3 times, and it quickly becomes very, very tedious. After this, we are taken to the second SpongeBob platforming level of the game, and this level is actually really solid. SpongeBob gets stuck in an Alaskan bullworm and needs to help Old Man Jenkins build a plane to escape. I like this section because there are a ton of really well written characters and the jokes are all actually really funny.
Your wife's an ironing board?
On top of that, the platforming has really hit its high for the whole game here. There are lots of different areas that will require you to use every move you learned so far and get somewhat creative in solving the puzzles the game throws at you. Unfortunately, some padding is thrown in here through another minigame that is rather boring, and it was actually so boring I walked away from it to go grab more coffee, and I came back and the game let me advance without actually beating it. Despite this padding, the level feels like it is an appropriate length and doesn't suffer the same pacing issues that the last level had. We then cut to Patrick, who's now strapped to a rocket ship and is flying around outer space. This level is incredibly simple, as all you have to do is collect fuel that is very generously placed throughout the level and fire at a very minimal amount of obstacles in front of you. Out of the whole game, this level feels the most like it doesn't belong in a SpongeBob game. Besides Patrick, there are no characters from the show, locations, or anything at least somewhat familiar to the audience. I understand that this is supposed to be a dream sequence, but the whole thing feels rather forced. This mission also suffers from being entirely too easy. The game telegraphs the obstacles that are going to be thrown at you and tells you which direction to fly your spaceship before the obstacle is even there. Once again, this is a kid's game, so I understand making it easier, but the game has already shown that it is at least somewhat capable of adapting difficulty. I just wish that this telegraphing was safe for players who have actually already died in this level quite a bit and not given to us from the get-go. There is another bonus game that's thrown in here, which is essentially a missile command clone, but thankfully it's not that bad and we only have to play it once. Then we have a very brief and easy standoff with a UFO before the mission comes to a close. We are then loaded into another Plankton section. This time, Plankton has made himself giant with his growth ray and is chasing the Krabby Patty through Bikini Bottom.
Who's your daddy now?
This level is really interesting. As Plankton stomps throughout the city, leveling everything in his path, you get the ability to shoot lasers out of your eye, which is really cool, stomp buildings to dust, and even make mini tornadoes. During this level, the game finally makes use of some of the really iconic Bikini Bottom locations, such as Mr. Krabs' Anchor House and Weenie Hut Jr.'s. You also have to fight the Bikini Bottom army through the level, which is really fun and ramps up the difficulty quite considerably. I actually died a few times. But as with the rest of this game, it goes on for way too long. I eventually found myself just deciding to not destroy everything in my path and casually walk by buildings because it just became too tedious. Eventually the level ends by having SpongeBob escape the bullworm and begin to circle the giant Plankton in SpongeBob's plane. So now, you take over as SpongeBob as he tries to avoid Plankton's attacks. Plankton is very clearly on a mission to destroy SpongeBob, and SpongeBob is innocently thinking that Plankton wants to be friends still. And this makes for some really fun dialogue that feels like it comes directly out of the show.
Careful, Plankton, you almost hit us!
As far as gameplay goes, this is very similar to Patrick's rocket ship mission. But this time the environment is by far more interesting as you see locations from the show, and you have to stay alert for Plankton's attacks despite the game telegraphing these attacks to you. Thankfully, this level doesn't feel overly long and ends with SpongeBob knocking Plankton over by destroying the support structures of a cell tower that Plankton was standing on. This is a really cool sequence as it feels like something that would come directly from a monster movie, and adds to the overall charm of the game. Then we get to play as Starfish Man one last time. This time we have to help SpongeBob take down the giant Plankton by fighting off Plankton's goons and completing a variety of puzzles over Bikini Bottom. This section is also really solid, as there's always a giant Plankton looming over you and he's actually pretty dangerous. But unfortunately the comic book aesthetic from the first Starfish Man level is completely gone. Eventually SpongeBob and Patrick beat the giant Plankton once and for all. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not going to spoil how they beat him or the final explanation for all this really strange stuff that's been happening throughout the game, but I strongly suggest that you watch the ending as it's still really funny. So here is where the Sleepy Seeds come into play. If you captured all the Sleepy Seeds in the Patrick sections, you get to play as Patrick in the final race. If you did the same thing for Plankton, you get to play as Plankton in the final race. But if you're like me and you didn't capture all the Sleepy Seeds for all the characters, then you just get to play as SpongeBob. After our final race, we are loaded into the SpongeBob ending. As I mentioned earlier, in order to get the Patrick and Plankton endings, you have to collect their Sleepy Seeds. And since I really didn't have any drive to play the sections of this game over again, and after looking at the Wikipedia article for this game and just seeing that all the endings are kind of similar, I just decided not to bother. So overall, how did I like SpongeBob Creature from the Krusty Krab? I think it easily deserves 7 out of 10 Krabby Patties. This game has some really strong sections in its platforming, but with the exception of the giant Plankton Godzilla section, which I actually thought was kind of fun, the flying, minigames, and Plankton run sections are all pretty big misses. If this game were ever to get the Battle for Bikini Bottom treatment and get remade, I'd like to see these sections to be either made more fun, or cut entirely in favor of expanding the platforming sections. I think it would have been a lot of fun to play as a microscopic Plankton trying to break into the Krusty Krab, or to make the Starfish Man sections more open world and allow the players to take on various side quests. Or even to make the final fight with SpongeBob not on rails, and have the player fight in an actual dogfight against Plankton. I feel like there are some really missed opportunities here that could have made this game a classic, but if you can deal with some of these more mundane sections of the game and are already a pretty big SpongeBob fan, then I strongly suggest you check this game out, as the characters are all really well written and the game is still pretty funny. As you probably can tell, I'm going to give this game a buy it, if you can find it for around $10. eBay says you should be able to do just that. Well, that's all from me, guys. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video.